When we begin to examine the opening phase of this conflict, what becomes immediately clear is that it did not erupt in a vacuum. It was not sudden. It was not accidental. It was the result of pressure, years of political tension, ideological opposition, and strategic mistrust, finally reaching a breaking point. And when pressure builds long enough, history teaches us one thing: it will find a release. What we witnessed in those early days was not just escalation, it was acceleration. Events did not unfold slowly enough for reflection. They moved with a kind of urgency that outpaced careful thought. Decisions were made in hours that would shape the lives of millions for years. And that, perhaps, is one of the most sobering realities of modern conflict: the speed at which human consequence follows political action. Now think about this from a psychological standpoint. When two powerful nations enter into confrontation, they are not just reacting to each other, they are reacting to perception. Each move is interpreted not only for what it is, but for what it might become. A defensive measure is seen as preparation for offense. A warning is heard as a threat. And before long, both sides are no longer responding to reality. They are responding to fear of possibility. That is how escalation feeds itself. As the conflict intensified, we saw strategic targets come into focus: infrastructure, military installations, and most critically, economic arteries. Among these, the Strait of Hormuz stood as more than just a geographic location. It became a symbol. A narrow passage of water, yet one that carries a significant portion of the world's energy supply. Control over it is not just tactical, it is psychological leverage over the global economy. And this is where the war begins to extend beyond its immediate participants. Because when oil routes are threatened, when supply chains are disrupted, the consequences ripple outward. A decision made in one region begins to influence the price of fuel in another, the stability of markets in another, the daily lives of people who may not even fully understand why their world is shifting. This is the nature of interconnected systems. Conflict in one corner becomes consequence everywhere. But let's go deeper. Beyond strategy and economics, there is a human dimension that often gets overshadowed by headlines and statistics. Casualties are reported as numbers, but numbers do not capture the full story. Each figure represents a life interrupted, a family altered, a future rewritten. And when those numbers begin to rise, something changes, not just on the battlefield, but in the collective psyche of both nations. There is a point in every prolonged conflict where initial conviction begins to erode. What starts as determination slowly transforms into fatigue. Not just physical exhaustion, but moral and emotional weariness. People begin to question, not always publicly, but internally, what is being gained and at what cost. And this internal questioning is powerful because it marks the transition from escalation to something else. Something quieter but no less significant: exhaustion. Exhaustion changes decision-making. It shifts priorities. It introduces a new variable into the equation: sustainability. Because no matter how strong a nation is, no matter how advanced its capabilities, there is a limit to how long it can operate under constant strain without consequence. Resources deplete, focus fractures, public sentiment shifts, and suddenly the conversation begins to change from "how do we win" to "how do we stop?" And here lies the paradox of escalation. The very actions taken to assert control can, over time, reduce it. The more aggressively each side pushes forward, the more they risk losing the very stability they seek to protect. It becomes a cycle: action, reaction, escalation, until both sides find themselves in a position they did not originally intend to reach. So when we talk about this phase of the conflict, we are not just talking about military maneuvers or geopolitical strategy. We are talking about a process, a chain reaction driven by perception, pressure, and human limitation. a process that reveals something deeper about how conflicts evolve and why they become so difficult to contain once they begin. And perhaps the most important insight we can take from this is this. Escalation is rarely about a single moment of decision. It is about a series of choices, each one justified in isolation, but collectively leading toward a destination no one openly chose. And that leaves us with a question, one that goes beyond this conflict, beyond any single moment in history. If we understand how escalation happens, why do we continue to walk the same path? Because until that question is answered, the cycle does not end. It simply waits. And just when it seemed that the momentum of escalation could no longer be slowed, something shifted, not dramatically, not decisively, but just enough to change the direction of the conversation. What emerged was not peace, not resolution, but something far more complex and, in many ways, more revealing, a ceasefire. Now, at first glance, a ceasefire appears to be a moment of relief. The weapons fall silent, the headlines soften, and there is a collective exhale across nations. But if we look more closely, if we move beyond the surface, we begin to understand that a ceasefire is not the end of conflict. It is the management of it. It is not peace, it is pause. And that distinction matters, because psychologically, a pause carries a very different weight than a resolution. When two sides agree to stop fighting but not to resolve the reasons they were fighting, what you have is not harmony, you have restraint. And restraint, while necessary, is inherently fragile. It depends on discipline, on patience, and most importantly, on trust. And in this case, trust was in short supply. Think about the mindset required to enter a ceasefire under these conditions. Both sides are aware of the cost of continuing the war, the exhaustion, the strain, the unpredictability. But at the same time, neither side is willing to concede on the core issues that led to the conflict in the first place. So what you have is a situation where both parties step back, not because they have resolved their differences, but because they recognize the consequences of not stepping back. This is not reconciliation. This is calculation. And calculation introduces its own kind of tension, because while the physical conflict may pause, the psychological conflict continues. Each side is still analyzing, still interpreting, still preparing. Every action during a ceasefire is observed more closely than during active conflict. Every statement is scrutinized. Every movement is questioned. The silence, in many ways, becomes louder than the noise that preceded it. Now consider the deeper philosophical layer of this. A ceasefire forces both sides, and indeed the world, to confront an uncomfortable truth that stopping violence is often easier than resolving the reasons for it. It is one thing to agree not to fight. It is another thing entirely to agree on why the fight began and how to ensure it does not happen again. And this is where the fragility becomes most apparent. Because unresolved issues do not disappear, they persist. They linger beneath the surface, shaping perception and influencing future decisions. Disagreements over power, security, identity, and control do not dissolve simply because there is a temporary halt in aggression. They remain, waiting for the conditions that will bring them back to the forefront. In many ways, a ceasefire is like placing a lid on a boiling pot. The heat is still there. The pressure is still building. The difference is that now, everything depends on whether that pressure can be managed, reduced, or released in a controlled way. But here's the challenge. Managing pressure requires more than agreement. It requires understanding. It requires a willingness to engage not just with what is happening, but with why it is happening. And that kind of engagement demands something that is often in short supply during and after conflict: humility. Because to move from ceasefire to peace, both sides must be willing to examine their own assumptions, their own narratives, their own justifications. They must be willing to ask difficult questions, not just about the other side, but about themselves. And that is where many ceasefires begin to falter. Not because the agreement itself is flawed, but because the mindset surrounding it remains unchanged. And so the ceasefire exists in a kind of tension-filled space. It is a bridge, but a bridge suspended over unresolved conflict. It offers the possibility of moving forward, but it does not guarantee it. It creates an opportunity, but it does not ensure it will be taken. From a broader perspective, this moment reveals something essential about human behavior, both at the individual and collective level. We are often more willing to stop what is painful than to confront what is difficult. We seek relief before resolution. We choose pause before transformation. But pause by itself is not progress. Progress requires intention. It requires effort. It requires a deliberate shift from reaction to reflection. And without that shift, the conditions that led to the conflict remain intact, ready to reemerge at any moment. So as we reflect on this ceasefire, we have to resist the temptation to see it as an endpoint. It is not a conclusion, it is a question about what comes next, about whether the space created by this pause will be used to build something more stable, more sustainable, more just, or whether it will simply serve as an intermission before the next act of conflict begins. And that brings us to a deeper, more personal level of understanding. Because this dynamic is not limited to nations or wars, it exists in our own lives as well. How often do we pause instead of resolve? How often do we step back without truly addressing what lies beneath the surface? The lesson here is not just geopolitical, it is human. A ceasefire gives us time, but time alone does not change outcomes. What we do within that time, that is what determines whether the future looks different from the past. And so the real challenge is not in stopping the conflict. The real challenge is in using the silence that follows to create something stronger than the noise that came before. Because if we fail to do that, then the ceasefire is not a step forward, it is simply a delay. And history has shown us time and again that delayed conflict is not diminished conflict, it is often intensified. So the question is not whether the fighting has stopped. The question is whether anything has truly changed. Because if nothing changes, then silence is not peace. It is just the sound of the next storm preparing to arrive. And so, with the guns temporarily silent and the world watching closely, attention shifted to what many believed would be the real turning point. Not the battlefield, but the negotiating table. Because if conflict reveals the limits of force, then diplomacy is supposed to reveal the possibilities of reason. It is where logic replaces aggression, where dialogue takes the place of destruction. At least that is the ideal. But what unfolded in those high-stakes talks reminded us of something far more complex, that diplomacy is not the absence of conflict. It is conflict expressed through words instead of weapons. Now imagine the intensity of that environment. Representatives from opposing sides sit across from one another, each carrying not just their own perspectives, but the expectations of entire nations. Every sentence is measured, every word is deliberate, and yet beneath that careful language lies something far less controlled: emotion, memory, suspicion. Because these discussions are not happening in isolation, they are shaped by years, even decades, of distrust. And this is where we begin to understand why diplomacy can be just as dramatic as war itself. Because in war, the objective is often clear: to weaken the opponent's capacity to continue. But in diplomacy, the objective is far more nuanced. It is not just about what you gain, it is about what you are willing to give up. And that introduces a level of psychological resistance that is incredibly difficult to overcome. Think about it. On the surface, negotiation is about compromise, but at a deeper level, compromise can feel like loss. It can feel like surrender, not of territory, but of identity, of principle, of perceived strength. And when leaders or representatives fear that perception of weakness, even the most reasonable proposals can be rejected. So what happens is this: both sides enter the room prepared to talk, but also prepared to defend. They listen, but they listen with caution. They respond, but they respond with calculation. And slowly, the conversation becomes less about understanding and more about positioning. Now layer onto that the pressure of time. These talks are often framed as urgent, as critical, as now or never moments. But urgency does not always produce clarity. It often produces rigidity. Because when people feel rushed, they tend to retreat into what they already know, what they already believe. They become less open, not more. And this is exactly how negotiations begin to break down, not through one dramatic failure, but through a series of missed connections, a proposal that is misunderstood, a statement that is interpreted as an insult, a silence that is seen as resistance. And before long, the space that was meant for resolution becomes another arena for conflict. But let's go even deeper, because there is a philosophical dimension here that cannot be ignored. Diplomacy requires a fundamental shift in perspective. It requires each side to recognize that the other is not just an opponent, but a participant in the same reality, that their concerns, however different, are real to them, that their actions, however controversial, are driven by their own internal logic. And this is where the true challenge lies, not in crafting agreements, but in cultivating understanding. Because without understanding, agreements become fragile. They exist on paper, but not in mindset. And when mindset does not change, behavior eventually returns to its original pattern. This is why so many negotiations feel like they are moving in circles, because the conversation is happening at the surface level, terms, conditions, concessions, while the deeper issues remain untouched, issues of trust, of perception, of historical grievance. These are not easily negotiated because they are not easily defined, and yet they are the very things that determine whether any agreement will last. Now consider the emotional dimension of all this. Behind the formal language and structured dialogue, there is a very human experience unfolding. Frustration builds when progress stalls. Tension rises when expectations are not met. And perhaps most importantly, doubt begins to creep in. Doubt about the process, about the possibility of success, even about the intentions of the other side. And once doubt takes hold, it changes everything, because doubt shifts the focus from how do we make this work to why should we trust this at all? And when that shift happens, negotiation becomes defensive rather than constructive. It becomes about protecting interests rather than expanding possibilities. So when talks collapse, as they often do under these conditions, it is easy to see it as failure. But in reality, it is something more revealing. It is an indication of how difficult it is to bridge not just political divides, but psychological ones. It shows us that the real battlefield is not always physical. Sometimes it exists in perception, in belief, in the stories we tell ourselves about the other side, and that realization carries an important lesson, not just for nations, but for all of us. Because in our own lives, we engage in our own forms of negotiation every day, in our relationships, in our work, in our interactions with others. And just like on the global stage, the outcome is rarely determined by logic alone. It is shaped by how well we listen, how willing we are to understand, and how open we are to seeing beyond our own perspective. So the collapse of talks is not just a political event. It is a mirror. It reflects back to us the limits of communication when it is not grounded in genuine understanding. And it challenges us to ask a deeper question. Are we truly trying to resolve differences, or are we simply trying to win the argument? Because those are not the same thing. And until that distinction becomes clear, until the goal shifts from victory to understanding, diplomacy will continue to struggle under the weight of its own expectations. So as we look at these failed negotiations, we should not just ask what went wrong, we should ask what was missing, because sometimes the absence of one quality, trust, empathy, patience, is enough to undo even the most carefully constructed agreements. And if we do not learn to recognize and cultivate those qualities, then no amount of strategy, no level of intelligence, no depth of preparation will be enough to sustain peace. Because in the end, diplomacy is not just about what is said across the table. It is about what is understood beneath it. And if understanding is absent, then even the most powerful words will fall silent long before peace ever has a chance to speak. And even as negotiations faltered and the ceasefire held on uncertain ground, something else was unfolding, something less visible, but no less powerful. The effects of this conflict were no longer contained within borders, no longer limited to strategy rooms or military zones. They were spreading outward, quietly but decisively, into the fabric of the global system. Because in today's world, no major conflict remains local for long. You see, we often think of war in terms of geography, where it is happening, who is directly involved. But the reality is far more interconnected. Economies are linked, markets are sensitive, supply chains are delicate. And when a disruption occurs at a critical point, the impact travels across regions, across industries, across lives. Consider the role of energy. When key transit routes are threatened, when uncertainty surrounds the movement of essential resources, the response is immediate. Prices fluctuate, markets react, governments begin to recalibrate, and what started as a regional confrontation begins to influence decisions in boardrooms, households, and institutions thousands of miles away. But here's what's important to understand. These reactions are not driven solely by events. They are driven by perception of risk. It is not just what is happening, but what might happen next that shapes global behavior. And this brings us into the realm of psychology once again, because uncertainty has a unique kind of power. It destabilizes not through force, but through anticipation. When people are unsure of what comes next, they become cautious. They hold back. They prepare for the worst, even if the worst has not yet occurred. And when that mindset spreads across entire systems, financial, political, social, it creates a kind of collective hesitation. Growth slows, confidence weakens, stability becomes fragile, and so the consequences of conflict begin to compound, not just in the immediate sense, but in the long-term shaping of global dynamics. Policies shift, alliances are reconsidered, priorities are redefined. And all of this happens not in isolation, but in response to a single underlying reality. The world is watching, and the world is adjusting. Now let's bring this to a more human level. Because behind every economic shift, behind every market reaction, there are individuals, people whose lives are being affected in ways that are often overlooked. A rise in fuel costs means higher transportation expenses. That leads to increased prices for goods. That affects families, businesses, communities, and suddenly a conflict that seemed distant becomes personal. This is the true reach of modern conflict. It does not ask for permission to impact you. It does not require your involvement to affect your reality. It simply moves through the systems we all depend on, reshaping them in ways that are both immediate and enduring. But beyond the material impact, there is also a psychological one. When the world appears unstable, when headlines are dominated by tension and uncertainty, it influences how people think and feel. There is a subtle shift from confidence to caution, from openness to defensiveness. And over time, that shift begins to shape behavior on a broader scale. Nations become more protective. Institutions become more risk-averse. Individuals become more focused on security than opportunity. And while that response is understandable, it also carries a cost, because progress, whether economic, social, or personal, requires a degree of openness. It requires the willingness to take calculated risks, to engage, to move forward despite uncertainty. And when fear begins to dominate that equation, progress slows. So what we are witnessing here is not just the aftermath of a conflict, but the emergence of a new mindset, one shaped by caution, by awareness of vulnerability, by recognition of how quickly stability can be disrupted. And this is where the philosophical dimension becomes clear. Global events are not just external occurrences. They are internal influences. They shape how we perceive the world, how we make decisions, how we define what is possible. And when those influences are rooted in instability, they challenge us to rethink not just our strategies, but our assumptions. What does security really mean in an interconnected world? What does stability look like when so many variables are beyond any single nation's control? And perhaps most importantly, how do we move forward in a way that acknowledges these realities without being limited by them? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, because the true impact of this conflict will not be measured only by what was lost or gained in the moment. It will be measured by how the world adapts in response, by the decisions that are made in its wake, by the lessons that are either learned or ignored. And that brings us back to something fundamental. Every crisis carries within it a form of instruction. It reveals weaknesses, exposes dependencies, and highlights the areas where change is needed. But recognizing those lessons is only the first step. First, acting on them, that is where transformation occurs. So as we look at the broader impact of this situation, we are faced with a choice, not just at the level of governments or institutions, but at the level of mindset. Do we respond with fear, allowing uncertainty to limit our vision? Or do we respond with awareness, using that understanding to build systems, relationships, and strategies that are more resilient, more adaptable, more prepared? Because the world is not becoming less complex. It is becoming more so. And in that complexity lies both risk and opportunity. The difference between the two is not found in the events themselves, but in how we respond to them. And that is where the real power lies. Not in controlling every outcome, that is impossible, but in shaping our response in a way that turns disruption into direction, uncertainty into insight, and challenge into growth. Because at the end of the day, global impact is not just something we observe. It is something we participate in. And the question is not whether the world will change. It already is. The question is whether we will rise to meet that change with clarity, with purpose, and with the courage to act. Because if we do, then even in the midst of conflict, something meaningful can emerge. But if we don't, then we risk becoming passive observers in a world that is being shaped without us. And that is a position none of us can afford to take. So don't just watch the world respond to crisis. Decide how you will respond to the world.